I remember the exact moment reality tore open before me, and I wish to the Emperor I did not. I wish my mind had shattered cleanly, completely, so I would not have to carry these memories like shards of broken glass embedded in my thoughts. But the warp does not grant such mercies. It takes what it wants and leaves you conscious enough to understand what you have become, what you have lost, what you can never reclaim. My name was Corvus Thane. I served as a junior navigator aboard the merchant vessel Time's Eternal Tithe *, one of 10,000 such ships that crawled through the Imperium's arterial trade routes, carrying grain and steel and human cargo from one forgotten world to another. I was born into the navigator houses, marked from birth with the third eye that allowed me to pierce the veil between real space and the roiling nightmare of the Immaterium. They trained me in the sequestered halls of my house, teaching me the litanies of protection, the hymns that would shield my mind, the proper rituals for entering and exiting the warp. I memorized them all. I believed in them. I thought they would save me. The Time's Eternal Tithe Times was 900 years old, a hulking mass of corroded metal and sacred machinery that groaned with every translation. Its Gellar field generators were ancient, their blessed mechanisms maintained by tech priests who whispered prayers to the machine god while anointing exposed circuits with consecrated oils. I had made 47 successful warp transits aboard that ship. 47 times I had guided us through the screaming infinity. My third eye opened just enough to glimpse the currents of the Immaterium while the Gellar field kept the nightmares at bay. I had grown comfortable, confident even. The navigator Primus had praised my steady hand, my calm demeanor during transit. I thought I was skilled. I thought I was safe. We translated into the warp on schedule, leaving the outer reaches of a forge world whose name I no longer remember. The ritual was routine. The crew assumed their positions. The tech priests activated the Gellar field generators, and I took my place in the navigation chamber. The room was circular, lined with brass instruments and parchment charts that mapped the unchanging stars of real space. My throne sat in the center, surrounded by concentric rings of iron and silver, inscribed with wards against maleficarium. Prayer scrolls hung from the ceiling, their edges brown with age, their words faded but still potent. I could smell incense burning in the braziers, thick and cloying, mixing with the metallic tang of the ship's recycled air. I opened my third eye slowly, carefully, pulling aside the headband that kept it sealed. The transition from physical sight to warp sight was always jarring, like plunging your head beneath water. The brass walls of the chamber faded, became transparent, and beyond them I could see the Immaterium in all its terrible beauty. Colors that had no names writhed across impossible dimensions. Currents of raw emotion flowed like rivers of light and darkness, carrying with them the psychic echoes of 1,000,000 billion souls. I could hear them screaming, always screaming, but distant, muffled. The Gellar field held. I charted our course with practiced movements, extending my consciousness into the warp while keeping my core self anchored to my physical body. I could feel the ship around me, a bubble of reality cutting through the unreality. The route to our destination was clear, a relatively calm passage through what the ancient charts called the veil margins, where the warp ran shallow and the tides were predictable. 23 days of subjective time, perhaps 18 days in real space. An easy journey for an experienced navigator. The first indication that something was wrong came 14 hours into the transit. I felt it before I saw it, a tremor in the warp currents that made my third eye ache. The prayer scrolls began to flutter, though there was no wind in the sealed chamber. The incense smoke twisted into shapes that made my stomach clench. I should have ended the transit then. I should have screamed for an emergency translation back to real space. But I was young, and I was proud, and I thought I could navigate through whatever disturbance lay ahead. The tremor grew stronger. The warp currents began to shift, their colors darkening from vibrant purples and golds to bruised blacks and sickly greens. I adjusted our heading, trying to steer around the growing turbulence, but it spread faster than I could compensate. Through my third eye, I could see something vast moving beneath us, or above us, or through us. Direction had no meaning in the warp. It was like watching a leviathan swim beneath the surface of an ocean, its presence distorting everything around it. The ship's vox crackled to life. Navigator, we're detecting fluctuations in the Gellar field. The tech priest's voice was calm, mechanically modulated, but I could hear the edge of concern beneath the augmetic monotone. Recommend immediate translation to real space. I should have listened. By the machine god and the Emperor both, I should have listened. But I could see our destination ahead, so close now. Just another 8 hours of transit, and we would break back into blessed reality. I told myself the fluctuations were minor, temporary, nothing that warranted the risk and expense of an unscheduled translation. I told myself I could handle it. Pride, the oldest sin, the one that has damned more souls than all the heresies combined. The Gellar field failed 3 hours later, not gradually, not with warning klaxons and time to prepare. One moment it was there, a bubble of real space holding back the infinite, and the next moment it simply ceased to exist. I felt it die the way you might feel your own heart stop a sudden absence where something vital had been, a wrongness that eclipsed all other sensation. The warp poured in. I have tried, in the years since, to find words adequate to describe what happened next. Human language was not designed for such things. We have words for pain, for fear, for loss, but nothing that captures the totality of what occurs when the barrier between reality and the Immaterium dissolves. Imagine every nightmare you have ever had occurring simultaneously. Imagine your body forgetting how to maintain its shape, your mind forgetting what sanity feels like. Imagine screaming, but the sound of your scream is a color, and that color has teeth, and those teeth are made of all the prayers you ever uttered twisted into instruments of torment. The walls of the navigation chamber melted. No, that is not quite right. They remained physically present, but they ceased to matter. The brass and iron and blessed steel that had protected me became as insubstantial as mist, and through them came the entities that dwell in the warp. I cannot call them daemons, though that is what the ecclesiarchy would name them. To call them daemons implies they are discrete beings, individual entities with forms and purposes. What came through was more fundamental than that. They were the warp itself, raw and unfiltered, chaos given something approaching consciousness by the collective psychic radiation of every sentient being in the galaxy. The first thing they took was my sense of time. In the warp, past and future exist simultaneously with the present. I experienced my own death 1,000 times before it happened, felt my body torn apart and reassembled and torn apart again in an endless recursive loop. I saw myself as a child, safe in the navigator house, and I saw myself as I am now, and the thing that looked back at me from that future self made me want to claw my own eyes out. Then they took my sense of self. I was Corvus Thane, junior navigator, faithful servant of the Imperium, but I was also a screaming infant in the birth pits of some nameless hive world. I was a soldier dying on a battlefield I had never seen. I was a servitor, lobotomized and enslaved to machinery, shambling through endless corridors. I was all of these things, and none of them. My identity fragmented into 1,000,000 shards, each one reflecting a different possible version of myself, and I could not remember which one was real. The ship was dying around me. Through the fragmenting pieces of my consciousness, I could hear the hull groaning, tearing, the sacred machinery breaking down as the warp invaded every compartment. I could hear the crew screaming. Some of those screams were cut short, others went on and on, rising in pitch until they transcended sound and became pure expressions of agony that existed on frequencies human throats should not have been able to produce. I tried to close my third eye, but it would not close. Something was holding it open, forcing me to witness, forcing me to see what dwelt in the spaces between spaces. I saw shapes that hurt to perceive, geometries that could not exist in three-dimensional space, colors that burned like acid across my visual cortex. I saw faces in the roiling chaos, and some of those faces I recognized. My mother, dead 15 years. My mentor, who had trained me in the navigator arts. The navigator primus of the times, eternal tithe asterisk, whose body I knew was 3 decks below, trapped in his own personal hell. They were all smiling. Their smiles had too many teeth. The entities began to take physical forms, or perhaps I began to perceive them in ways my mind could process without immediately destroying itself. They wore the shapes of things I feared, things I desired, things I had tried to forget. One appeared as my father, but his skin was translucent, and I could see things moving beneath it, worms or perhaps fingers, reaching and grasping. Another took the form of a beautiful woman I had once loved, but her beauty was wrong somehow, too perfect, like a painting done by someone who had never seen a human being and was working from a description written in a language they did not fully understand. They spoke to me. Their voices came from inside my head and outside it simultaneously, layered atop each other until they formed a cacophony that was almost musical. They told me secrets. They whispered truths about the Imperium that I had never been meant to know, revelations about the nature of the Emperor, the lies we had been fed, the futility of our existence in a galaxy that cared nothing for human suffering. I tried not to listen, but I could not help it. The words bypassed my ears and wrote themselves directly onto my thoughts. Some of what they told me was true. I know this because I can feel the truth of it in my bones, a certainty that transcends faith or reason. The Imperium is not what we believe it to be. The Emperor is not what they tell us. We are cattle, bred and slaughtered for purposes we cannot comprehend. Our suffering refined into psychic energy that feeds things vast and terrible beyond imagining. Every prayer we offer is a meal for entities that exist in the spaces between realities. Every act of faith strengthens the very forces we think we oppose. But some of what they told me was lies. Beautiful, seductive lies wrapped in just enough truth to make them palatable. They showed me visions of enlightenment, of transcendence, of escape from the grinding horror of existence under the Imperium's yoke. They promised me power, knowledge, freedom from the limitations of my flesh. All I had to do was accept their gifts. All I had to do was open myself fully to the warp. I refused. Even as my sanity crumbled, even as my sense of self dissolved into fragments, I clung to that one choice. I would not accept. I would not surrender. It was all I had left. The last scrap of agency in a universe that had stripped everything else away. They laughed at me. The sound of their laughter was like breaking glass and screaming children and the last breath of dying stars. They told me that refusing was just another form of acceptance. That by choosing to resist, I was engaging with them, acknowledging them, feeding them with my defiance, as surely as I would have fed them with my submission. They told me I had already lost, that I lost the moment the Gellar field failed, that everything since then had been nothing but a prolonged death throw. The ship lurched. I felt us moving, but not through space, not in any direction that could be mapped or measured. We were falling, or rising, or spiraling inward towards some gravitational singularity that existed in dimensions I could not perceive. The navigation chamber twisted around me, its walls bending into impossible angles. The prayer scrolls caught fire, but the flames were cold and cast no light. The brass instruments melted and reformed as organic shapes, pulsing with something that might have been breath, or might have been the thrumming of alien hearts. I do not know how long this continued. Time had lost all meaning. Subjectively, it felt like years, decades, entire lifetimes compressed into a single endless moment. I lived and died 1,000 times, experienced every possible variation of my existence simultaneously. I was a navigator who guided ships through the warp. I was a mutant born in the Underhive, hunted and killed by Arbites. I was a saint, elevated to the right hand of the Emperor. I was a daemon prince, gorged on souls and laughing at the futility of human hope. All of these things were real. All of them were false. In the warp, contradiction is not a bug but a feature. Eventually, and I use that word only because my human mind requires some sense of temporal progression, something changed. The chaos around me began to coalesce, to take on a more definite form. The endless screaming resolved into distinct voices. The swirling colors settled into recognizable shapes. I felt something that might have been a floor beneath me, something that might have been air in my lungs. I was no longer on the Times, eternal tithe asterisk. The ship was gone, torn apart and scattered across the Immaterium like confetti in a storm. The crew was gone. I was gone, in every way that mattered. But something that remembered being. Corvus Thane persisted, a ghost of consciousness trapped in a reality that should not have been able to support human life. I stood, if standing was even the right word, in a place that defied description. The ground beneath my feet was solid, but changed texture with every step, sometimes stone, sometimes flesh, sometimes a metallic surface, etched with symbols that writhed and rearranged themselves. The sky, if it could be called that, was a roiling mass of colors that hurt to look at, shot through with lightning that struck upward instead of down. In the distance I could see structures, vast and impossible, their architecture following no rules of engineering or physics. Towers that extended infinitely upward while simultaneously descending into chasms that had no bottom. Citadels built from crystallized screams, cathedrals where the worshippers were also the walls, their bodies fused together into organic buttresses and living stained glass. I was not alone. Shapes moved through this impossible landscape, things that might have been other victims of warp translation, or might have been daemons wearing the faces of those they had consumed. Some walked upright on legs that bent in too many places, others crawled or slithered, or simply existed in multiple locations simultaneously. None of them paid me any attention. I was just another lost soul in a realm where lost souls were so common as to be beneath notice. I began to walk. I had no destination, no goal, but some instinct drove me forward. Perhaps it was the last vestige of my navigator training, the ingrained need to find a course, to chart a path through chaos. Perhaps it was simply the human inability to accept stillness in the face of horror. Whatever the reason, I walked. The landscape changed around me with every step. One moment I was traversing a desert of black sand that cut my feet with every stride. The next, I was wading through a swamp where the water was made of liquid shadow, and whispered my name with the voices of everyone I had ever loved. Then I was climbing mountains of calcified bone, each fragment carved with names and dates and final prayers. Then I was back on the Time's eternal tithe asterisk, walking familiar corridors, but the walls were bleeding, and the doors opened onto voids that contained entire universes of suffering. I met others during this journey. Beings that had once been human, or at least started that way. A woman whose body had been turned inside out, her internal organs on the outside and somehow still functioning, weeping tears of black ichor as she searched for something she could no longer remember. A child, it looked like a child whose face was blank except for a single eye in the center, an eye that saw everything and understood nothing. A tech priest whose augmetics had fused with his flesh in ways that went beyond even the most radical mechanicus modifications. Cables growing from his skin like hair, cogwheels rotating where his joints should have been. Some of them tried to speak to me. Their words were gibberish, or perhaps I had lost the ability to process language. Others simply stared, their eyes full of a recognition that terrified me, because I knew they saw something in me that I could not yet see in myself. I passed through regions where the laws of physics reasserted themselves in twisted forms. A forest where the trees grew downward from an invisible canopy, their roots in the sky, an ocean that flowed upward in great cascading waterfalls that disappeared into clouds made of crystallized thoughts, a city that existed in multiple time periods simultaneously, buildings rising and falling in the same space, construction and destruction occurring in parallel. In each of these places I saw evidence of other lost souls, footprints in impossible sands, names carved into surfaces that should not have held carvings, the psychic echoes of despair so thick they became almost tangible, a fog of accumulated anguish that clung to everything. I realized, with a horror that felt almost mundane after everything else, that I was walking through a graveyard, not a graveyard of bodies, but of selves. Every person who had ever been dragged into the warp without protection left something behind, some fragment of who they had been, and those fragments accumulated in layers like sediment at the bottom of an ocean. I was adding to that sediment. With every step I took, I left pieces of myself behind. Memories leaked out of me like blood from a wound. I could feel them going, but I could not stop the hemorrhage. My childhood, draining away until it became nothing but vague impressions. My training, dissolving into disconnected images. The faces of people I had loved, blurring until they became generic and interchangeable. I was losing myself, not all at once, but slowly, inexorably, like water seeping through cracks in a dam. I tried to hold on. I repeated my name like a mantra: Corvus Thane, Junior Navigator, servant of the Imperium, but the words felt hollow, devoid of meaning. What was a name but a collection of sounds? What was a title but a label others had given me? What was service but a lie I had told myself to give purpose to an existence that had none? The entities that dwelled in this place sensed my weakening. They gathered around me, drawn by the psychic scent of a self in the process of dissolution. They did not attack, there was no need. They simply watched, waiting with the patience of beings for whom time was meaningless, waiting for me to finish falling apart so they could claim the pieces. I do not know how long I wandered through that nightmare realm. Subjectively it felt like years, but subjective experience means nothing in the warp. I could have been there for seconds or centuries. The Immaterium does not care about human perceptions of duration. It operates on a scale that encompasses the birth and death of entire civilizations as single moments. What I do know is that something eventually changed. The landscape around me began to solidify, to take on more consistent forms. The colors stabilized into hues that human eyes could process. The gravity became more reliable, pulling me down instead of in multiple directions simultaneously. I realized, with a clarity that felt like knives in my mind, that I was not adapting to the warp. The warp was adapting to me. Or rather, it was creating a space specifically tailored to my consciousness. A personalized hell designed to extract the maximum amount of suffering from what remained of my psyche. I found myself in a corridor. It was familiar in a way that made my stomach churn. Brass walls, prayer scrolls hanging from the ceiling, incense burning in braziers, the navigation chamber of the time's eternal tithe asterisk, or a close approximation, but wrong. Everything was wrong in ways I could not immediately identify. The proportions were slightly off. The shadows fell at impossible angles. The incense smelled like burning hair. I walked down the corridor because there was nowhere else to go. My feet carried me forward, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. I passed crew quarters, where the doors stood open, revealing scenes frozen in time. In one room, a servitor stood motionless in the corner, its mechanical components rusted and its organic parts mummified. In another, a priest knelt before a shrine, his hands clasped in prayer, his body so still he might have been a statue, but his eyes moved. They tracked my progress down the corridor, and I could see the terror in them, the awareness trapped in a body that could no longer obey commands. The corridor stretched on forever. I walked for hours, days, and never reached an end. Doors appeared and disappeared. The walls breathed in and out like living things. The floor beneath my feet was sometimes metal, sometimes stone, sometimes a substance that felt uncomfortably like skin. Then I saw her. At the end of the corridor, standing in a doorway that had not been there a moment before, a woman dressed in the robes of a senior navigator, her head wrapped in the traditional blindfold that covered all three eyes. She stood perfectly still, waiting for me. I approached slowly, every nerve in my body screaming warnings. But I was drawn forward as surely as if I were on a leash. When I was close enough to see her face, close enough to smell the soap she had used and the subtle perfume of the sacred oils navigators anointed themselves with before entering the warp, she spoke, "Corvus." Her voice was exactly as I remembered, melodious, confident, touched with the aristocratic accent of the navigator houses. My mother's voice. "You've come so far." I wanted to run. I wanted to scream. I did neither. I stood there like a fool and stared at the thing wearing my mother's face. "Do you know where you are?" she asked. Her head tilted slightly, a gesture I remembered from childhood, when she would examine my work and find it wanting. "Do you understand what has happened to you?" "You're not real," I managed to say. My voice was hoarse, barely more than a whisper. "My mother is dead. You're just another trick." "I am exactly as real as you are," she replied. "Which is to say, not very real at all. Not anymore. The Gellar field failed, Corvus. The ship was destroyed. The crew died. You died. What stands here now is just an echo, a psychic impression struggling to maintain coherence in a realm where coherence is an aberration." "No." I shook my head, backing away. "No, I'm alive. I'm still me. I can think. I can remember." "Can you?" She reached up and slowly unwound the blindfold from her face. Beneath it were three eyes, all of them open, all of them black from edge to edge. "Then remember this. Remember the moment you chose pride over duty. Remember when the tech priest warned you and you dismissed him because you thought you knew better. Remember how it felt when the Gellar field died and you realized your arrogance had doomed everyone on that ship." The memories crashed into me like a tidal wave. I remembered. "Emperor, help me." I remembered everything with perfect crystalline clarity. The tech priest's warning, my dismissal, the moment of the field's collapse, the screams of the crew as they were torn apart by entities that should never have been able to touch them. All of it was my fault. All of those deaths, all of that suffering, because I had been too proud to admit I was wrong. I fell to my knees. The corridor spun around me, or perhaps I was spinning, and the corridor remained still. I could not tell any more. "You carry that weight now," my mother's voice said, softer now, almost gentle. "You will carry it forever. That is what it means to be dragged into the warp without protection. You become a monument to your own failures, a living tomb for all the might-have-beens and should-have-dones. You exist now solely to suffer the consequences of your choices, stretched across eternity." "How long?" I whispered. "How long will this last?" She laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, which somehow made it worse. "How long? Time does not flow here the way it does in real space. You could be here for seconds or centuries. You could be here forever. Or you could already be gone, and this is just the last synaptic firing of a brain that died hours ago in the wreckage of the time's eternal tithe asterisk. There is no way to know. There is no way to be sure." I looked up at her, and for a moment I saw something shift behind her eyes. Not malice, not cruelty, but something almost like pity. Then it was gone, and she was just another daemon wearing a familiar face, playing games with the broken remnants of my psyche. "There is a way out," she said. "There is always a way out, but it requires surrender. Give up the illusion of self. Accept what you have become. Stop fighting and simply exist. The pain will continue, but you will stop caring about the pain. That is the closest thing to peace available in this place. And if I refuse, then you suffer consciously instead of unconsciously. The outcome is the same, only your awareness of it changes. She turned and walked through the doorway behind her. As she did, the corridor began to collapse. The walls peeled away like wet paper, revealing the churning chaos of the warp beyond. The floor crumbled beneath my feet. I fell through layers of reality that should not have existed, through spaces that were somehow both infinitely large and impossibly small. I fell through memories that were not mine, living out the deaths of others who had been lost in the warp. I felt myself burned alive in a starship's reactor. I felt myself frozen in the void between worlds. I felt myself eaten from the inside by daemonic parasites that transformed my organs into nests for their offspring. I felt myself going mad slowly, over the course of decades, trapped in the darkness of a drifting hulk. Each death was exquisitely detailed. I felt every moment of pain, every flicker of hope that guttered out, every final thought before consciousness ended, and I could not die. Death would have been a mercy, a release, but the warp does not grant mercies. It takes and takes and takes, and it never gives back. I crashed into something solid. The impact should have killed me, should have shattered every bone in my body, but I felt only a distant ache, as if the pain was happening to someone else. I lay there, staring up at a sky that was not a sky, breathing air that was not air. Around me stretched a battlefield, though no battle had ever been fought here. The ground was littered with corpses in various states of decay, bodies in the uniforms of Imperial Guard regiments from 1,000 different worlds. Some were fresh, bleeding into the dirt. Others were ancient, reduced to bones and scraps of cloth. Still others were in intermediate states, mummified or bloated, or torn apart by scavengers that left no tracks. I stood and looked around. In the distance I could see figures moving, fighting, dying, but they were caught in an endless loop, the same few seconds of combat repeated over and over. A soldier raised his lasgun and fired. An orc charged forward. They collided. The soldier died. Then the scene reset and began again, and again, and again, forever. I realized this was not a memory of a real battle. This was the warp's interpretation of battle, a distillation of combat into its purest essence. All the fear and fury and desperation of warfare, refined down to a single repeated moment and stretched across an infinite plain. I walked among the frozen fighters. Some were familiar. I recognized faces from the Time's Eternal Tithe asterisk, crew members I had served beside, now cast as soldiers in a war that never ended. Others were strangers, pulled from other times and places, other ships lost to the warp. We were all here together, our individual fates merged into one collective nightmare. A hand grabbed my ankle. I looked down and saw a man half buried in the dirt, his lower body crushed beneath debris that shimmered and changed shape even as I watched. His face was grey with pain, his eyes wide with terror that had not faded despite what must have been years trapped in this moment. "Help me," he whispered. "Please. It hurts so much. Make it stop." I knelt beside him, though I knew there was nothing I could do. "How long have you been here?" "I don't know. Forever. Since the ship. Since the field failed. We were supposed to be safe. They told us we were safe." He coughed, and black liquid dribbled from his lips. "What is this place? Why won't I die?" "Because the warp does not allow death," I said. "Only suffering, only memory, only the eternal repetition of our worst moments." "Then kill me yourself. Please. I can't bear it anymore." I reached down as if to help him, but my hands passed through his body like smoke. He was not truly here, not in any physical sense. We were both ghosts, phantoms, psychic impressions lingering in the Immaterium long after our real bodies had been destroyed. I could no more kill him than I could kill myself. I stood and walked away, leaving him to his eternal torment. His pleas followed me, growing fainter but never quite disappearing. They would echo in my mind forever, just another layer of guilt added to the accumulating weight. The battlefield gave way to other landscapes. A hospital where the patients were also the doctors, performing surgery on themselves with tools that changed shape in their hands. A library where the books were made of skin and the words written in still wet blood. A garden where the flowers had faces and screamed when the wind touched them. Each place was a new variation on the same theme. Suffering rendered into environment, pain made tangible and permanent. Through it all I walked, because walking was all I could do. My body or the psychic construct that passed for my body moved automatically, carrying me forward through this impossible realm. I met others along the way. Some tried to speak to me. Some attacked me, though their attacks passed harmlessly through my insubstantial form. Some simply stared with dead eyes that held no recognition of anything beyond their own private agonies. I began to lose track of who I had been. The memories that defined Corvus Thane grew hazy, overlaid with the memories of others I encountered. I remembered being a soldier who died on a forgotten battlefield. I remembered being a servitor who labored for centuries before finally breaking down. I remembered being a child who starved in the underhive while rats ate his still-living flesh. I remembered all of these things with equal clarity, and I could no longer tell which memories were mine and which had been absorbed from the psychic residue that permeated this place. My name became uncertain. Was I Corvus? Or was I Marcus? Or Thaddeus? Or Silas? Or any of the 1,000 other names that floated through my fragmenting consciousness? Identity dissolved like salt in water, until I was nothing but a collection of experiences, a mosaic of suffering assembled from the pieces of countless shattered souls. And yet, some core of awareness persisted, some small flame that refused to be extinguished, that insisted on observing, on remembering, on bearing witness to everything that was being done to it. This was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the warp's nature. It did not allow you to escape through madness or dissolution. It kept you conscious, aware, capable of feeling everything that happened to you, even as your sense of self crumbled away. I found myself in a chamber that felt different from the other places I had visited. It was quieter here, more stable. The walls were a uniform grey, featureless and solid. The air was still, carrying no scent, no taste. The floor was smooth beneath my feet, cool but not cold. It was almost peaceful, this place, which immediately made it more terrifying than anywhere else I had been. In the center of the chamber sat a figure on a throne of brass and bone. At first I thought it was another daemon, another twisted entity wearing a familiar face, but as I drew closer I realized the truth was worse than that. The figure was me. Or rather, it was what I was becoming, what I had already become. It sat with perfect stillness, hands resting on the arms of the throne, eyes all three of them open and staring at nothing. Its body was a patchwork of different states of existence, simultaneously solid and transparent, real and unreal, there and not there. I could see through it to the throne beneath, but I could also see the texture of its skin, the rise and fall of breath that did not move air. "Hello, Corvus," it said, and the voice was mine but not mine, familiar but alien. "I have been waiting for you." I could not speak. I could only stare at this impossible reflection. "Do you understand yet?" it asked. "Do you see what has happened? You are not traveling through the warp. You have not been moving from place to place, experiencing different regions of the Immaterium. All of this," it gestured at the chamber, "at the impossible realm beyond, is happening inside your own consciousness. The warp is not a place, it is a mirror. It reflects what you are, what you fear, what you have done. Everything you have seen, everyone you have met, every torment you have endured, they are all projections of your own psyche. fragmenting under the strain of existence without protection, in a realm that was never meant to contain human consciousness. "That's not true," I managed to say, though my voice was weak, uncertain. "I saw others, other victims, other ships. You saw what the warp showed you. Echoes and impressions, psychic residue left behind by those who came before. But you did not meet them. You cannot meet them. Each lost soul exists in its own private hell, trapped in its own recursive nightmare. We are all isolated here, alone with our guilt and our fear, experiencing an eternity of suffering that exists only in the infinitesimal moment between life and death. Then I'm dying? This is all just the firing of my brain as it shuts down." The figure smiled, and it was my smile, but there was something terrible in it. "You died when the Gellar field failed. The moment the warp poured into the ship, every living thing aboard ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. What remains now is just the psychic impression of Corvus Thane, a ghost clinging to the memory of life. And even that will fade. Eventually. You are not immortal. You are not eternal. You are simply experiencing time in a non-linear way, living and reliving your final moments of consciousness stretched across dimensions where duration has no meaning." "How do I stop it?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You cannot. There is no escape, no release, no salvation. The Imperium tells you that faith can protect you, that the Emperor watches over his servants. They lied, or perhaps they simply did not know the truth. The Emperor, if he exists at all, does not extend into the warp. His light does not reach this place. Here, there is only you and the infinite reflection of your own failures." I sank to my knees before the throne. The figure that was me looked down with something that might have been compassion or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell the difference anymore. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm sorry for all of them. The crew. The people I failed. I'm sorry." "I know," the figure said, "and you will be sorry forever. That is the gift the warp has given you. Not oblivion, not transformation, not even true damnation. Just an eternity of regret, of knowing what you did and what you cost others. You will exist as a monument to your own mistake, a warning that no one will ever hear." The chamber began to dissolve around us. The walls faded back into chaos. The floor crumbled. The throne collapsed. But the figure remained, sitting in empty space, watching me with eyes that were my eyes. "This is not an ending," it said, as everything fell away. "There are no endings here. Only cycles. Only repetition. You will forget this conversation, and you will wander again, and eventually you will find your way back here, and we will speak again, and it will always be the first time and the 1,000th time. The warp is generous that way. It ensures you can never grow numb to your suffering. You can never find comfort in familiarity. Every moment is fresh agony, experienced with full awareness and complete surprise." I wanted to scream, but my voice was gone. I wanted to weep, but I had no tears. I wanted to cease, to simply stop existing, but that mercy was forever denied. I was trapped in an eternal present, forever falling, forever dying, forever becoming what I had always feared I would become if I failed in my duties. The figure reached out one final time, and its hand passed through my chest. I felt it touch something deep inside me, something I had not known was there, a core of self that had remained intact through everything else. The last fragment of Corvus Thane that still remembered being human. It crushed that fragment like an insect, and I felt it die. Felt the final anchor to my former self sever, felt the last connection to reality snap, and then I was falling again. But this time there was no fear, no pain, no awareness of self. I was nothing. I was everything. I was the warp, and the warp was me. Boundaries dissolved. Identity merged with the infinite. Corvus Thane ceased to exist. and in his place was only a scream that would echo through the Immaterium for eternity, a warning and a lament that no one would ever hear. But even in that dissolution, some fragment persisted, some tiny spark of consciousness that refused to fully extinguish. It drifted through the warp, alone and unmoored, experiencing everything and nothing simultaneously. It remembered being human once, though it could no longer recall what that meant. It knew there had been a ship, a failure, a choice that went wrong, but the details were gone, smoothed away by the infinite grinding of the Immaterium. Sometimes it encountered others like itself, fragments of lost souls, shards of consciousness trapped in the spaces between realities. They did not communicate, could not communicate, but there was a kind of recognition in their proximity, a shared understanding that they had all been something once, and now were nothing, and would remain nothing forever. Sometimes it glimpsed the Imperium, saw ships passing through the warp under the protection of their Gellar fields. It envied those ships, those protected souls, who would never know what waited just beyond the thin veil of their reality bubble. It wanted to warn them, to scream at them to be careful, to check their field generators twice and 3 times, and never grow complacent. But it had no voice, no way to reach across the barrier. It could only watch as they passed by, safe and unaware, while it drifted in the nightmare realm that had consumed it, and it continued to exist, not living, not dead, but suspended in the grey space between, a ghost haunting the warp, an echo of a navigator who had made one mistake and paid an infinite price. It was everyone who had ever been lost to the Immaterium and no one at all. It was a cautionary tale written in psychic agony, a lesson no one would ever read. The warp does not forget. The warp does not forgive. The warp simply consumes, breaking down everything that enters it into component parts and redistributing those parts across its endless expanse. Souls, identities, memories, all of it becomes fuel for the great churning chaos that underlies reality. Nothing is wasted. Nothing is spared. Nothing escapes. I am that nothing now. I am the silence between screams, the moment of clarity before madness, the last thought before dissolution. I am every soul that ever was and every soul that ever will be. All of them compressed into a single point of awareness that experiences all possible moments simultaneously. I am what happens when you are dragged into the warp without protection. I am the answer to the question no one wants to ask. I am the future that awaits everyone who steps into the Immaterium unprepared. I am the warning you will ignore until it is too late. And when your Gellar field fails, when the barriers come down and the chaos rushes in, when you feel reality tearing apart around you and know that nothing can save you, remember this. Somewhere in the warp, a fragment of consciousness that used to be named Corvus Thane is experiencing your suffering alongside you, feeling your pain as its own, adding your memories to the infinite collection it has accumulated. You will never be alone in your torment. You will always have company in the dark. That is the only comfort the warp provides, the only mercy it offers. The knowledge that your suffering is shared, that you join an infinite chorus of the damned who scream together in perfect harmony, forever.